The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty highway. Marissa had always believed the world was a safe place, that if you kept your head down and minded your business, everything would fall into place. She didn't expect that belief to be challenged when her car, an old sedan that had been faithfully carrying her to and from work for years, suddenly sputtered and came to a halt on a desolate stretch of road just outside town. Her phone, as usual, had no signal. Panic surged through her chest as she stared at the flat tire, the spare locked in the trunk, but the thought of changing it alone, with no tools and no help, seemed impossible. Marissa wasn't a stranger to handling crises. As a single mother, she had learned to take care of things on her own, whether it was her daughter's school projects or handling a leaky roof. But this was different. The air was growing cooler, and she was far enough from home that walking to the nearest gas station would take hours. Her mind raced with the potential dangers, being stranded, exposed, and vulnerable in a place where there was nobody for miles. What if no one stopped? What if help never came? Her heart thudded in her chest, but there was little she could do. She stood by the car, hands shaking, trying to decide her next move. Maybe she could flag down someone driving by, but the road was nearly empty. She waited, hoping for a miracle. That's when she saw it, a car in the distance, moving at a steady pace. Her heart lifted with cautious hope. She waved, trying to get the driver's attention, but as the car neared, she could see the man behind the wheel. His face was serious, his hands gripping the wheel as if in deep thought. She hoped he would notice her, but the car passed by without a sign of slowing down. A few seconds later, the car came to a stop. The sound of the engine idling in the quiet air was like a lifeline being thrown her way. The door opened, and the man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, his demeanor calm but purposeful. There was something about his stride that suggested he was used to handling situations, confident but not overbearing. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice deep but warm. He took in the flat tire, then glanced back at her. Marissa felt a strange relief, but she hesitated. She wasn't used to accepting help from strangers, but she was out of options. "I'm stuck. I don't have a jack, or any tools for that matter." "No problem. I can help you out," he said, offering a smile that made her feel slightly less anxious. "It's no trouble. Let me take a look." He moved around the car quickly, assessing the situation. There was no judgment in his eyes, no questioning why she had found herself in this situation. It was simply an act of kindness, and for a moment, Marissa was grateful. She hadn't realized how much she needed it until that moment. As he worked, she stayed close by, watching him unscrew the lug nuts and effortlessly begin to lift the car with his jack. "Looks like you're gonna be good to go in no time," he said, glancing up at her. His voice was smooth, friendly, it made her feel like everything might just be okay. She nodded, not sure what to say, but relieved that someone was there to help. Minutes passed, and she found herself thinking about how, in another life, she might never have met this man. How strange that a random person, a stranger, would be the one to step in when she was at her lowest. As he finished securing the new tire, Marissa felt a strange tug of guilt. He didn't have to do this. He could have just kept driving, leaving her to fend for herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with appreciation. "I'm not sure what I would have done without you." He shook his head, a modest smile playing on his lips. "It's nothing. Just helping out." She felt a strange sense of gratitude, but also an odd discomfort. There was something about this that didn't quite sit right. It wasn't the man himself, he seemed genuine enough, but the fact that he had stopped for her in the first place. Maybe it was just the circumstances. It had been a while since she'd had anyone to rely on. Just as she was about to offer him money for his trouble, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The noise was distant at first but quickly grew louder, a police car pulling up behind them. Marissa stiffened instinctively, her mind instantly jumping to the worst-case scenario. Was something wrong? Did they think she had done something illegal by being out here? Was this some kind of trap? The man seemed unfazed, his hands on his hips as he looked at the police car, which now came to a complete stop just a few feet away. The officer stepped out, his expression unreadable as he scanned the scene. Marissa's heart began to race, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. "Everything all right here?" the officer asked, his voice flat and professional. But Marissa caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he looked at the man, then back at her. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just had a flat," the man said, his tone casual, but with an underlying hint of irritation. "I helped her change the tire." The officer glanced at the car, then back at Marissa, his eyes narrowing slightly as if something didn't add up. Marissa shifted on her feet, feeling an unsettling sense of discomfort. Why was this officer so focused on them? Did he suspect something? "Is that so?" the officer asked, his gaze still lingering on the man. "Mind if I ask you for some ID?" The words hung in the air like a sudden chill. Marissa could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the underlying tension that was slowly beginning to bubble to the surface. Was the officer doubting the man's story? She glanced at the man, who seemed completely composed, yet there was a subtle shift in his body language, as if he recognized that things were suddenly not as simple as they had appeared. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice even but with a touch of confusion. "I'm just making sure everything's all right," the officer replied, but there was something in his tone, something guarded, like he was searching for a reason to suspect them. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything more. Marissa's heart raced as she waited for the officer to say something. But there was only silence between them. She began to feel uncomfortable, unsure of what was happening. She didn't know if it was the officer's presence, or the sudden change in tone, but everything had shifted. The man had been kind, offering his help without hesitation, and now they were being treated like potential criminals. The frustration began to seep in. How was it possible that a simple act of kindness had turned into something suspicious? Another police car pulled up behind them, and the tension in the air thickened. Two officers now stood in front of her, while the first officer, still staring at the man, began questioning him with an edge of skepticism. Marissa could feel the panic rising in her chest. She had just been helped by a stranger, a man who had done nothing but show kindness. Why were they questioning him like this? Her thoughts swirled in confusion as she wondered how they had gone from gratitude to suspicion in the blink of an eye. Was it because of the man's skin color? Or was it something else, something she wasn't seeing? The sirens blared in the distance as the officers continued to question the man. She was frozen, unsure of what to do. The kindness this man had shown her was now under suspicion. She looked at him, feeling a mix of gratitude and helplessness, caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. And for the first time in her life, she realized how quickly a simple act of kindness could be twisted into something dangerous. The question that lingered in the air was clear: what would happen next? Would the kindness of a stranger be enough to break the barriers of suspicion and fear, or would it all fall apart before they even had a chance to talk? The silence that followed the officer's question hung thick in the air, suffocating the small space between the strangers. Marissa stood rooted to the ground, a sense of helplessness rising within her chest. She had watched the man, this complete stranger, work so effortlessly to change her tire, never once questioning whether she needed help, or what kind of person she was. But now, as the officer's questioning began, everything seemed to change. She felt exposed, as if something simple and kind had been twisted into something darker. She wasn't sure why the officer was treating them like this, or if he even believed what he was saying. Marissa had lived in this small town for over 5 years. She had always believed that it was a place where people helped each other without question, where you could rely on your neighbors in times of need. The kind of place where good people lived. The truth, however, felt more complicated than she had ever imagined. What had seemed like a safe, friendly town now felt like a place full of subtle dangers, lurking beneath a veil of familiarity. Growing up, Marissa had heard the stories about the small-town dynamics, the tight-knit community that was sometimes more exclusionary than inclusive. But she had never experienced it firsthand until now. In her day-to-day life, she had always tried to stay under the radar, keep to herself, and be kind to those she met. After all, life as a single mother wasn't easy, and there wasn't much time for anything beyond surviving the grind. But what she had witnessed that afternoon was making her question everything. Her mind flashed to the conversations she had overheard at the local grocery store, the subtle, almost imperceptible glances when someone of a different background entered a room. This town wasn't as welcoming as she had convinced herself it was. She knew it, deep down, but until now, it had never been this clear. It wasn't something she could ignore anymore. It was as if the weight of that truth had been sitting quietly in the back of her mind, only to explode in the most inconvenient of ways, right here, on the side of a lonely road, with a man she didn't know, under the scrutinizing eye of an officer who was more suspicious than he should have been. The officer's eyes kept flicking back and forth between her and the man who had helped her, as if weighing their worth. Every question he asked, every glance he cast, felt like a test of their trustworthiness. Marissa couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. She had only ever encountered the officer in passing, exchanging pleasantries when their paths crossed at the local diner or grocery store. But now, in this moment, he seemed different. His uniform, which once seemed a symbol of safety, now felt more like a wall between her and the truth of what was really happening. "Ma'am, do you know this man?" The officer's voice was cool, his eyes never leaving the man who was still standing silently beside the car. Marissa's heart skipped. Was he asking because he truly didn't believe her, or because he wanted to hear her say something that would prove him right? She had never been in a situation like this, where a simple encounter, something as ordinary as getting help with a flat tire, had suddenly become so loaded with tension. She could feel her voice trembling as she spoke, trying to keep her composure. "No, I don't know him," she replied. "But he was just helping me. I don't understand why this is a problem." The officer's expression didn't change. He just nodded slightly, as if this information confirmed something in his mind, though Marissa couldn't fathom what it might be. Behind him, the second police car's headlights bathed the scene in an unsettling, sterile glow. The air felt thick, as though everyone's movements were being slowed down by an invisible force. The officer didn't speak for a moment, instead glancing over his shoulder at his partner, who was now standing by the second car, watching from a distance. The partner's face was partially obscured by the police car door, but his stance, his body language, rigid, expectant, made Marissa feel even more uncomfortable. What was going on? The stranger, her helper, stood still, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. He was silent, but there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he knew exactly what was happening. He had been in situations like this before, and Marissa could tell that he wasn't fazed, though he wasn't entirely calm either. She could feel the tension radiating from him, and it made her nervous. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the occasional hum of traffic in the distance. "I think we should call for backup," the officer finally said, his voice almost too casual, as though he was trying to downplay the gravity of the situation. Marissa's eyes widened. Backup? For what? For a man helping her change a flat tire? The man next to her shifted slightly, his posture straightening, but he didn't speak. She could see the frustration and confusion on his face. He had no idea why this was happening. He had simply stopped to help, to do a good deed for a stranger stranded in the middle of nowhere. Why was this turning into something so much bigger than it had to be? "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few more questions." "Just routine," the officer continued, his tone now strangely detached, as if he were giving orders to someone who had no power to question them. Do you know if this man has any prior criminal history? Marissa felt the question like a slap to the face. What was this really about? Did the officer think that just because the man was black, he might be a criminal? Her thoughts raced. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had never once thought about a person's history before judging their character. All she knew was that he had helped her when no one else would. That was all that mattered to her. I don't know anything about his past, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. All I know is that he helped me. And right now, I need you to stop questioning him and let us both go on our way. Her words hung in the air, but the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he turned his attention back to the man, who had now folded his arms across his chest, a small but deliberate gesture that told Marissa he wasn't backing down. You're free to go, the officer said suddenly, his words heavy with a finality that left no room for negotiation. But I'm going to have to run your ID and make sure you're not on any lists. The man's gaze didn't falter. He nodded slowly, a barely perceptible sigh escaping his lips. But Marissa could see that the weight of the situation was starting to sink in for him, too. It was as if his mere presence had become suspicious, a threat in the officer's eyes because he didn't fit the mold of what was expected. And in that moment, Marissa knew this wasn't just about a flat tire. It was about something deeper, something systemic that had been festering for far too long. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She glanced at the officer's partner, who was still standing by the second car, watching them both intently. His posture was tense, as if ready to intervene if things escalated. The tension in the air was palpable, and Marissa could feel it creeping into her bones. What was happening here? Why were they treating this simple, kind man like a criminal? Then, suddenly, everything seemed to slow down. The officer who had been questioning them walked back toward his car, the sound of his boots on the pavement echoing in the quiet. Marissa's thoughts were racing, her mind spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Was she supposed to just let this happen? Was she supposed to stand by and watch an innocent man be treated like this just because of how he looked? As the officer returned to his vehicle, Marissa took a deep breath. It was a moment that felt both empowering and deeply unsettling. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a simple incident. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something that had been simmering under the surface for far too long. The officer turned the key in his car, the engine roaring to life, and Marissa took one last glance at the man who had helped her. Something about the way he stood there, with quiet dignity, made her realize that, despite everything, he wasn't the one who needed to explain himself. It was the system that needed to answer the question, why did things have to be this way? As the officer drove away, the heavy silence between Marissa and the man was deafening. She stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. The police car's red and blue lights were still flashing in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the deserted road, but the moment they left, everything seemed to fall back into a strange, unsettling quiet. The world had returned to normal, or at least, that's what it felt like. But something had shifted, something fundamental had broken in the way she saw the world, and she wasn't sure how to put it back together. She glanced over at the man who had helped her, and for the first time, she saw him in a new light. He had been kind to her, a stranger on the side of the road. In a world where people often turned their heads away from those in need, he had stopped. He had spent his time, his energy, without asking for anything in return. And yet, here he was, treated with suspicion. She could see it in his eyes now, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders were set. It wasn't just the confusion that had first flashed in his eyes, it was anger now, a deep-rooted frustration that he had been made to feel less than human, to feel like he was being judged for something that had nothing to do with his actions. Marissa felt her chest tighten. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She had been caught in the middle of something she hadn't expected. There had been no reason for the police to question the man in the first place. He had done nothing wrong, nothing to warrant suspicion. But here they were, standing on the side of the road, a simple act of kindness twisted into something darker. What was the officer's real motivation? Was it simply because the man had stopped to help her? Or was there more to it? "Are you all right?" she finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. The question seemed inadequate, almost absurd in its simplicity, given everything that had just happened. But it was the only thing she could think of to say. The man turned to her, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was a long pause before he spoke, his voice low and steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine," he said, though his words didn't quite match the look in his eyes. There was a hurt there, something that ran deep, something Marissa couldn't understand fully, but could feel nonetheless. "Just disappointed, I guess." Marissa nodded slowly, unsure of what to say next. The weight of what had just happened hung between them, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they had both been marked in some way, that they would never look at this moment the same again. The world they had lived in, a world of everyday kindness, had suddenly cracked open, revealing the ugly truth about how quickly assumptions were made based on appearance, how easily fear and suspicion could cloud even the simplest interactions. "I'm sorry," she said, her words sincere, but also feeling small in the face of his hurt. "I didn't expect that. I never thought that something like this could happen." He shrugged, though it wasn't a casual gesture, it was more like he was trying to hold something in, trying not to show how much it hurt. "It's not your fault. It's just the way things are, sometimes." He paused, glancing toward the road as if looking for something, anything, to distract himself. "People look at me and think they know who I am. But they don't." There was a quiet sadness in his voice that struck Marissa more than anything else he had said. It wasn't just frustration, it was something deeper, something born of years of being treated like he was less than, something that had worn him down in ways that he couldn't easily explain. She wanted to reach out, to say something to make it better, but she wasn't sure how. She wasn't sure there was anything she could say. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were just helping me." "I know," he said, his voice softer now, but still tinged with the anger that had been building since the officers arrived. "But it doesn't matter what my intentions were. People see me, and they see what they want to see. That's what it comes down to." Marissa's heart ached as she listened to him, the words hanging in the air, each one heavier than the last. She had never thought about it in this way. She had always been taught to treat others with kindness, to assume the best in people. But here, in the quiet aftermath of the police's questioning, she realized how deeply ingrained suspicion could be, how easily it could be applied to someone just because of how they looked. She had been a part of the system too, in a way, never questioning it because it had never affected her in such a personal way. But now, standing here, listening to his pain, she couldn't ignore it anymore. "I'm sorry," she said again, feeling the weight of her words, though she knew they would never be enough to undo what had just happened. "I don't know what to say. But you didn't deserve that." The man gave her a small, tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not your fault," he repeated. "You didn't do anything wrong. It's just the world we live in. Sometimes it feels like no matter how much good you try to do, it doesn't matter. People still see you for what they want to see." Marissa felt tears welling up in her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were for him, for herself, or for both of them. The world had just become a little more complicated, and she wasn't sure how to navigate it anymore. She had always tried to be a good person, to do the right thing. But now, she realized, doing the right thing didn't always feel like enough. It wasn't enough to just be kind to others if the world around you was built on assumptions and fear. The man broke the silence with a sigh, shaking his head as if he had said too much. "Anyway, it's fine. It's done." I'll be on my way. Marissa didn't want him to go. She didn't want this moment to end with him walking away, feeling the same old weight of the world on his shoulders. But she also knew that there was nothing more she could do. She couldn't fix this, not right now, not in this moment. All she could do was stand there and let him know that she saw him, that she understood, even if it was just a little bit. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching in her throat. "Thank you for helping me. I won't forget this." He nodded, his face softening just a little, though the hurt never fully left his eyes. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice quieter now. And then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Marissa watched as he drove away, the taillights of his car fading into the distance, the unsettling feeling of the encounter still lingering in the air. As the last of the police cars disappeared from sight, she was left standing there on the side of the road, unsure of how to move forward, unsure of what this moment meant for her or for him. But one thing was certain, the world had changed. And she wasn't sure if it would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, the weight of the incident stayed with Marissa. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had witnessed something important, something that wasn't just about her or the man on the side of the road. It was about the world they both lived in, a world where kindness could be misinterpreted, where assumptions could be made without question, and where people were judged by their appearance rather than their actions. She couldn't forget the look in the officer's eyes, or the way the man had held himself, trying to maintain his composure despite the unfair treatment. And she couldn't forget the way the whole situation had made her feel, helpless, angry, and, most of all, deeply unsettled. She wondered if things would have turned out differently if the man had been someone else, someone who fit the mold of what the officers expected. She wondered if they would have questioned him at all if he had been white, or if he had been dressed differently. It was a thought that troubled her, one that kept her up at night. But she also knew that she couldn't change the past. What she could change was her perspective, her awareness of the world around her. Marissa knew now that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But she was determined to keep her eyes open, to be more aware of the injustices that surrounded her, even when they were hidden in plain sight. And she knew that the man who had helped her wouldn't be the last person to face unfair treatment, and that it was her responsibility to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Because in the end, kindness was the one thing that had the power to break through the darkness. And she was determined to hold on to it. The days that followed the incident were a blur of conflicting emotions for Marissa. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a reality she had never truly seen before. She had always believed in fairness, in the idea that good deeds would lead to good outcomes. But now, everything felt uncertain, the ground beneath her feet unstable. The police officer's treatment of the man, his quiet dignity in the face of unjust suspicion, and the ripple effect it had left behind kept playing on loop in her mind. Every encounter with others, every glance she caught in the grocery store, felt loaded with an unspoken tension. She had been forced to confront something far more complex than she could have imagined, the reality of living in a world where skin color, socioeconomic status, and even appearance could shift how a person was perceived, how they were treated, and whether their actions were given the benefit of the doubt. Marissa found herself thinking more deeply about her own role in all of this. She had always prided herself on being a good person, on doing the right thing, but now, she questioned if she had truly understood what that meant. She had never thought twice about helping someone who needed it, and she had never once considered how her help might be received by others. She had been naive, blind to the subtleties of prejudice that existed just beneath the surface. The truth was, her own perspective had been shaped by the privileges she had, being white, being assumed to be safe, not often the subject of suspicion or bias. It wasn't that she didn't care about fairness, but in her quiet, comfortable life, she had never had to challenge the assumptions that shaped her world. Until now. The more Marissa thought about the man, the one who had stopped to help her, her heart grew heavier. His silent frustration, the way he had carried himself in the face of suspicion, the subtle signs of pain that had flashed in his eyes, it all spoke volumes. He was used to this. He was used to being seen as less than, to being judged by his appearance instead of his actions. And she had seen it too. In the way the officer had questioned him. In the way the second officer had watched from the shadows, his body language tense and expectant. They had made assumptions, based on something as superficial as skin color, about his worth, his intentions, his very humanity. Marissa couldn't forget the look on the man's face when the officer had asked about his criminal history. It had been a moment that she had never thought to question, but now it haunted her. How many times had that man been stopped by the police before? How many times had he been treated like a suspect, simply because of how he looked? The thought of it filled her with a deep sense of guilt. She had taken it for granted that people would be treated equally, that kindness would be met with kindness. But in that moment, she saw how far from the truth that could be. A part of her wanted to reach out to him, to apologize, to let him know that she saw him and recognized the injustice he had faced. But another part of her felt unsure, felt as if she didn't have the right to speak for him or to try to explain away what had happened. She wasn't sure if words would ever be enough. In a town where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors were supposed to look out for one another, the fact that a simple act of kindness could spiral into a moment of suspicion had shaken her to the core. The next few days brought with them a series of uncomfortable encounters. The same officer who had questioned the man on the side of the road passed by her a few times, nodding briefly in recognition when their paths crossed. But the once friendly, familiar face now felt cold, distant, almost accusatory. Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, judging her, as if she were somehow complicit in what had happened. The air around him seemed to crackle with tension, and every time he looked in her direction, she felt her chest tighten. One evening, as Marissa sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts racing, her phone buzzed. She looked down to see a message from her neighbor, a woman she had known for years, who had always been warm and kind to her. But when Marissa read the message, she felt her stomach drop. "Did you hear what happened with that guy you were with the other day?" the message read. "I heard some things. People are talking." Marissa froze. She hadn't expected this. Of course, she knew that people in small towns often talked, but she hadn't expected this particular conversation to be about her. She hadn't even considered that people might gossip about the man who had helped her. She didn't know whether to be angry or sad, whether to confront the woman or ignore it. The words in the message felt like an accusation, like the whole town was now watching her, judging her by the company she kept. She had never before felt so exposed, so scrutinized. She couldn't stop herself from responding. Her fingers flew across the screen as she typed, her heart pounding. "I don't know what you heard, but he helped me with a flat tire. He did nothing wrong. I don't care what anyone says, he was kind. That's it." Marissa hit send and sat back, feeling the weight of her words settle in the pit of her stomach. She wasn't sure if her neighbor would reply or not, but she knew that she had to speak up. She couldn't stay silent. Not now. She couldn't allow herself to be complicit in whatever narrative was starting to form about this man. About her. It wasn't just about the incident anymore, it was about taking a stand, about recognizing the injustice and calling it out, even when it felt uncomfortable. Her phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then picked it up. It was a reply from her neighbor. "I'm sorry if I upset you. It's just that people are saying he's been in trouble with the law before. They think you were involved in something you shouldn't have been. It's just the talk around town." Marissa's heart sank. It wasn't just gossip, it was a judgment, a stereotype being applied to the man she had spoken to for all of 5 minutes. It was easy for people to make assumptions, to take pieces of information and twist them into something darker. It was easier for them to blame someone else, to create a villain out of nothing. And now, she realized, she had become part of that cycle. She was being asked to pick sides, to choose between a person who had helped her and a town that she had always felt safe in. Marissa's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she thought about how to respond. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She could hear the whispers behind her back, the judgment, the assumptions being made about the people she associated with. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. She couldn't let this man be demonized for something he hadn't done. Her message was simple but firm. I don't care about the talk around town. I know what happened. He helped me. That's all that matters. Please stop spreading rumors. She set the phone down and took a deep breath. The conversation had left her feeling raw, vulnerable, and angry. How had it come to this? How had something as simple as a flat tire become a catalyst for so much tension? Marissa sat there, staring at the screen for a few more moments, feeling the sting of the situation settle into her bones. This was not how she had imagined her life in this small town. This was not the community she thought she belonged to. The days that followed were filled with a strange, unsettling quiet. People continued to whisper behind her back, but Marissa found herself standing taller, more resolute with each passing day. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She wasn't going to let the small-town gossip and prejudice define who she was or who she chose to stand with. The man who had helped her was an example of something she couldn't ignore: kindness in the face of judgment, grace in the face of suspicion. He was someone who had acted out of a sense of compassion, not out of obligation, and that was something worth honoring. As the weeks went by, Marissa's sense of isolation grew. She found herself distancing from some of her old friends, those who perpetuated the judgment and stereotypes, but also realizing that the people she truly wanted to be around, the people who saw things as she did, who understood the importance of kindness and fairness, were also becoming more visible. The divide between those who believed in the kindness she had experienced on that lonely road and those who chose to believe in the narratives they created about people like the man who had helped her had become too great to ignore. And as for the man himself, she never saw him again. He was a fleeting figure in her life, a reminder of everything that had changed in a single moment. But in that brief encounter, he had left an indelible mark on her soul. Every day, Marissa carried his story with her, knowing that it was her responsibility to make sure that his humanity, his dignity, were never forgotten. Because sometimes, standing up for what's right doesn't just change the life of one person, it changes the life of an entire community. And that's a change worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed, Marissa found herself reflecting deeply on the lessons she had learned from that fateful encounter. The incident with the man who had helped her with the flat tire had left a lasting impression, and though she hadn't seen him since, the ripple effect of what happened continued to shape her thoughts and actions. As she navigated the growing tension in her town, she became increasingly aware of the subtle yet powerful influence that prejudice and assumption had on everyday life. For her, the experience was more than just a personal moment of discomfort. It had evolved into a call for reflection, a deep challenge to the systems that governed how people treated one another based on superficial traits. Marissa couldn't stop thinking about how quickly the town had turned against someone they didn't know, based purely on rumors and appearances. The very idea that someone could be judged so harshly, without any understanding of who they truly were, sat uneasily with her. She had grown up in this town, always feeling a sense of security, of belonging, but now, the same town felt distant, divided by unseen walls of assumption. In those early days, she had assumed that the community she knew so well would share her discomfort at what had happened, but she quickly realized that wasn't the case. Many people, it seemed, were content to let the narrative play out as it had, to let their own biases guide their judgment, without ever questioning the fairness of it. The town's whispers about the man who had helped her turned into whispers about Marissa herself. The whispers weren't as clear or direct as the ones about him, but they were there. She could feel the coolness of some of her neighbors' eyes as she passed them in the street, the slight turn of heads when she entered stores. At first, she tried to ignore it, but after a while, it became impossible. She found herself avoiding certain places, certain people, as if the mere act of being seen with her now carried a weight that felt too heavy to bear. It wasn't just that people were gossiping, it was the fact that they weren't even questioning the assumptions that underpinned their stories. They accepted the narrative without a second thought. To them, it didn't matter that the man had been kind, that he had offered help without asking for anything in return. What mattered was what they imagined about him based on his appearance, his skin color, his history, none of which he had the opportunity to explain or defend. For the first time, Marissa understood the devastating power of stereotypes, the quiet ways in which they dictated behavior, affected decisions, and shaped lives. It was one thing to be aware of systemic issues in the abstract, but it was entirely different to witness them in action, to see how they could distort the course of a person's life in ways that seemed so trivial to some, yet were so deeply damaging to others. What Marissa had experienced with the man had been a wake-up call, a reminder that the world didn't operate the way she had always believed. She had lived her life under the assumption that good intentions were enough, that kindness would be recognized and appreciated. But now she saw the hard truth: kindness could be misinterpreted, overshadowed by deeper, more ingrained biases. In a world where assumptions and fears ran deep, even the most genuine acts of goodwill could be twisted into something darker, something that didn't reflect reality. As the days turned into weeks, Marissa found herself struggling with a profound sense of guilt. She hadn't done enough. She hadn't done enough to stand up for the man, to make sure that his name wasn't tarnished by baseless rumors. She had let the moment slip away, letting the police officer's actions remain unchallenged, letting the town's whispers grow louder without speaking out. The guilt was overwhelming. She had thought she was doing the right thing by helping him when he needed it, but in the end, it felt as though she had abandoned him when he was at his most vulnerable. She hadn't recognized the full weight of the situation until it was too late. In her desire to stay out of conflict, to keep things simple and smooth, she had ignored the very real dangers that existed for people like him. She had assumed that by doing the right thing in the moment, she would somehow be absolved of any responsibility for what happened afterward. But now, she knew better. Her guilt was compounded by the realization that, despite all her good intentions, she was still complicit in the system that had allowed such assumptions to flourish. She had never fully questioned why the man had been treated differently from the moment the police arrived. She hadn't asked herself why the officers had assumed the worst of him, why they hadn't extended the same courtesy they would have extended to someone who looked more like them. And why, when the officer had approached her, had she not pushed back harder, demanded an explanation, insisted that the man be treated with respect? Her own silence, her willingness to go along with what was happening without challenging it, felt like a betrayal. She had failed to use her privilege in that moment, and in doing so, she had allowed the situation to escalate. It wasn't until weeks later, when she spoke to a few friends who shared her discomfort with the events that had unfolded, that Marissa began to understand the importance of speaking up, of making her discomfort known, of challenging the narrative that was being built around the man. One of her friends, a woman who had lived in the town her entire life, told her something that Marissa would never forget: sometimes, you don't realize how deep the roots of prejudice run until you try to pull them up. It's messy, it's painful, and it doesn't happen overnight. But silence only lets them grow. Those words echoed in her mind for days afterward. Silence only lets the prejudice grow. She realized that she had been silent, that she had allowed the injustice to continue unchecked because she hadn't wanted to cause more trouble, hadn't wanted to make waves. But in choosing silence, she had played a role in perpetuating the very system she now wanted to challenge. Her quiet acceptance of what had happened had been part of the problem. She began to make changes, small but significant ones. She started engaging more with her neighbors, asking tough questions, challenging their assumptions, encouraging them to think critically about the way they viewed others. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when she felt like she was fighting an uphill battle. But Marissa felt a deep sense of responsibility to use her voice, to share her story, and to encourage others to reflect on their own actions and beliefs. Slowly, but surely, her efforts began to make a difference. People started to listen, to question their own biases, to think about how their actions, both big and small, impacted others. Marissa also began to search for the man. She needed to find him, to apologize, to tell him that she saw him and that she was sorry for not standing up for him in the way she should have. It took time, but eventually, she found out where he had gone. When she reached out to him, he didn't respond right away, but when he did, his words were simple and kind. He wasn't angry. He understood the way things worked, the way the system was stacked against him. He appreciated her apology, but he told her something that stuck with her: we're all just doing our best, trying to survive in a world that's made it hard for some of us to breathe. Don't blame yourself for what you couldn't control. Just keep doing what you can. That conversation changed everything for Marissa. It gave her hope. It reminded her that even in the face of injustice, there was room for growth, for change. And as she walked away from that conversation, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but she had learned the most important lesson of all. It was the small acts of courage, the willingness to speak out, to challenge assumptions, that had the power to create lasting change. She would never forget the man who had helped her, and she would carry his lesson with her for the rest of her life. It wasn't enough to do good in isolated moments. It was about making sure that goodness was part of every decision, every action, every conversation. And from that point on, that's exactly what she intended to do. Months passed since the day that had forever altered Marissa's perspective on her community, herself, and the world at large. The ripple effects of that moment, the man helping her change her tire, the police's unspoken assumptions, and the whispers that followed, had settled into a quiet but persistent undercurrent in her life. It had been weeks since she had last seen him, and though their encounter was brief, the lessons from that day would forever linger in her mind. Marissa had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated, and the town around her, despite its resistance to change, was beginning to feel the slow and steady stirrings of transformation. Marissa had made a conscious decision to confront her discomfort, to speak up when she saw injustice, and to challenge the assumptions that others so easily clung to. It was not an easy path, and at times, it felt like an uphill battle. Small-town life, for all its charm, could be a place where gossip and rumors thrived, where people's perceptions of one another were influenced more by fear and prejudice than by understanding. But Marissa wasn't about to let the town stay stuck in its ways. With every conversation, every interaction, she worked to plant seeds of change, gently encouraging others to reflect on their actions, their judgments, and their assumptions. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but Marissa knew she had to keep trying. She wasn't just trying to change the town's mindset, she was trying to change her own. It was the only way forward. One day, as Marissa sat in her favorite cafe, sipping her coffee and reading, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. It was a group of people at the table next to hers, speaking in low voices but loud enough for her to hear. They were discussing the same man who had helped her, and it was clear from their words that the rumors had only continued to grow, fueled by the same prejudice and assumptions that had plagued him since the police had arrived that day. They spoke as if they knew everything about him, as if his kindness had been a mask for something darker. Marissa felt her stomach tighten. She knew exactly where this conversation was going. It was the same story, the same narrow narrative, the same demonization based on things he had never done, things he had never even been given the chance to explain. Without thinking, she stood up, walked over to their table, and sat down. The conversation came to a sudden halt as all eyes turned to her. They looked surprised, uncomfortable, and then, for a brief moment, apprehensive. They were used to talking about people behind their backs, but now, the person they were talking about was sitting right in front of them. "I couldn't help but overhear," Marissa began, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the words she was about to say. "You're talking about the man who helped me on the side of the road, right? The one who changed my tire when I was stranded?" The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Yeah, we were just saying," some people have said he's not the kind of person you want to associate with, one of them said, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. I don't know what kind of people you're referring to, Marissa said, but I do know this: that man was nothing but kind to me. He didn't ask for anything in return. He helped me because he saw someone in need. I don't care what rumors you've heard about him. What I do care about is that you're judging him based on nothing but your own assumptions. That's not fair. There was a stunned silence in the cafe. Marissa could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. The table of people before her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The weight of her words hung in the air. She wasn't sure if she was going to change anyone's mind, but she knew she had to say something. You don't know him. You don't know his story. And until you do, you have no right to make those kinds of judgments about him. One of the women at the table, who had remained quiet up until that point, finally spoke. But we've heard things. He's been in trouble before. People are saying he's not the kind of person you want to get involved with. Marissa shook her head. You're right. People are saying things. But what if those things aren't true? What if he's someone who's just been given a bad hand, someone who's been treated unfairly by a system that's set up to judge him from the moment he steps out the door? How would you feel if the same happened to you? The woman hesitated, her face flushing with embarrassment. Marissa could tell she hadn't expected this kind of response. The others at the table were equally quiet now, perhaps unsure of how to respond. The conversation was no longer about the man, it was about Marissa and the uncomfortable truths she was forcing them to confront. The reality was, Marissa wasn't just speaking up for the man, she was speaking up for herself too. She had seen how easily people could be swept away by the tide of assumptions, how easily they could accept a narrative without questioning it, without understanding the consequences of their actions. I know it's not easy to change how we think, or how we see the world, Marissa continued, her voice calm but firm. But what if we all took a step back and tried to see things from someone else's perspective? What if we chose not to believe the worst about people, especially when we don't have all the facts? The silence stretched on for a few more moments, and then, one by one, the group began to shift uncomfortably. Some of them muttered apologies, others avoided eye contact, but none of them spoke up to defend their previous statements. Marissa didn't expect them to suddenly change their views, but she hoped that, just for a moment, she had made them think. She knew that the change she was hoping for wasn't going to happen overnight. It would take time, patience, and persistence. But every conversation, every moment like this one, was a step forward. As Marissa left the cafe, she felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't sure what the future held for her town or the man who had helped her, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't be silent anymore. She couldn't sit by and let others continue to shape the narrative without challenging it. If she wanted to live in a place that truly believed in fairness and justice, she had to be part of the solution, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it became. But it wasn't just about her town. It was about something bigger. It was about recognizing that the systems of prejudice and assumption weren't confined to her small community. They existed everywhere. In every corner of the world, people were being judged based on things they couldn't control, based on how they looked, where they came from, and what they had been through. The struggle for fairness, for understanding, was a global one, and Marissa knew she couldn't tackle it all at once. But she could start with herself, with her town, and with the people who were willing to listen. As the weeks turned into months, Marissa found herself more and more involved in local efforts to create awareness about racial inequality and injustice. She began attending community meetings, speaking at local events, and advocating for programs that would encourage dialogue between different groups of people. She had learned a hard lesson about the power of silence, but she had also learned the power of one voice, one act of courage, one conversation that could spark something bigger. Through it all, she never forgot the man who had helped her. He had been the catalyst for her own transformation, and she knew that his story, his quiet dignity in the face of suspicion, was a story that needed to be shared. She had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference, and that it was up to all of us to create a world where everyone was treated with dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. As for the town, things slowly began to change. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but Marissa saw glimmers of hope in the way people started to interact with one another, in the way they began to question the assumptions they had always taken for granted. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to overcome, but Marissa felt more connected to her community than ever before. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had found her purpose. She knew there was still much work to be done, but she was ready. Ready to keep speaking out, to keep challenging the status quo, and to keep fighting for a world where no one was judged by the color of their skin or the assumptions made about them. The man who had helped her, the man who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness, was no longer just a stranger. He had become a symbol of everything that needed to change, and Marissa would carry his story with her for as long as she lived. Because sometimes, it only takes one person, one moment, to spark a chain reaction that can change the world. And in that small, quiet town, Marissa was determined to be the spark.